It's spooky week, so let's revisit the 2006 Academy Award nominated film Monster House. Giving this a rewatch for the first time since I originally saw it in theaters, I have a lot of questions. The movie opens telling me it's directed by Gil Kenan, which I don't really know much about him, and from his IMDb, it looks like not many people do know a lot about him. This was his directorial debut from a screenplay by Dan Harmon and Rob Schrab. Now, if those names sound familiar, Rob Schrab has done a lot of things within TV, and Dan Harmon is the mind behind two of the most self-aware sitcoms of the past 2 decades. Gil Kenan finds this movie, wants to direct it, so he takes it up to DreamWorks. Eventually gets a meeting with Robert Zemeckis and Steven Spielberg. That's right, Robert Zemeckis and Steven Spielberg, two industry giants. The plot is essentially this. There's a 12-year-old boy DJ who lives across the street from this haunted house. There's this neighbor, this old man, who basically creates the Clint Eastwood trope of get off my lawn.
Get off my lawn!
And he takes kids' toys and their belongings, and so the kids want it back. Played by Steve Buscemi, Nebuchadnezzar apparently dies, and these kids are terrified, but then the house starts calling them. They decide to investigate and eventually learn that this house is an actual person. In fact, it is Nebuchadnezzar's wife. His deceased wife, Constance, was buried into the cement of this house, and this house pretty much took on her soul. The house is alive, they have to try to destroy it, and the movie ends with them going trick-or-treating, which they thought they were too old for, but turns out they're not. Let's first start with the cast of this movie, because it is so 2006. And I say cast because this isn't just voice acting. In fact, this is one of the biggest things that Robert Zemeckis brought to the film. With his studio image movers, this film was entirely motion capture, meaning they suit up, put a bunch of dots on their face, and essentially act out the entire movie. So yes, it is animated, but it's not a typical animation. In fact, at this point, the only other movie that did this was The Polar Express, and Robert Zemeckis would later do it with Beowulf and A Christmas Carol, and eventually turn into a really comical trope of himself, but at this point, this was only the second time it was done. So let's start with the leading man, Mitchel Musso. Now, the crazy thing about Monster House is it kind of came out the same time Hannah Montana premiered, and they filmed Monster House starting in 2004, so this was way before he was popular from that show. And really, he hasn't done anything since, at least notable, which makes sense if you spend about 10 seconds on his Wikipedia page seeing he had some pretty major legal troubles.
What did you do?
Supposedly, it's wrong to backtalk to your parents.
Honestly, Mitchel Musso at this point is almost as relevant as his brother Mason Musso, who is the lead singer of, that's right, Metro Station. Which I don't want to get too off topic here, but let's not forget that Metro Station was literally formed when Mason Musso and Trey Cyrus met on the set of Hannah Montana. But back to Monster House. The other kids are voiced and acted out by Sam Lerner and Spencer Locke, who also haven't really done too much notable or that you'd recognize them from since that. But the rest of the cast are very notable. You have Steve Buscemi as Nebuchadnezzar. You have Catherine O'Hara and Fred Willard as the parents. You have Maggie Gyllenhaal and Jason Lee as the babysitter and her boyfriend Bones. Kevin James and Nick Cannon in a literal buddy cop role. Kathleen Turner as Constance, the house. And what I'm gonna chalk up as another very 2000s decision, John Heder as Skull. John Heder is another one that they just kind of threw in everything after Napoleon Dynamite, and I'm not quite sure what stuck. Going through more specific details of this movie, the opening shot is another thing completely inspired by Zemeckis. It's this opening tracking shot on one single item that really gives you an introduction to the world. He uses this in a lot of his movies, and this is definitely something you would not notice as a child. The pacing of this movie is really something special. For the first third of this movie, you're kind of just being introduced to these kids and this neighborhood and this honest mystery of like what is going on in this house. Once the old man supposedly dies, they try to figure it out, and the characters are really quite charming. The way that they move around, the way that they interact with each other, and they have some decent jokes that actually kind of hit, especially as an adult.
My dad's at the pharmacy and my mom's at the movies with her personal trainer.
The way that it feels kind of all placed within a very small portion of this neighborhood, the universe does feel small, and I think that's to its advantage. You feel like you know every single character, from the cops to the parents. It's all very self-contained. Once they eventually start to go into the house, that's where the movie really picks it up, and I think by this point, you're just on the edge of your seat waiting for it to happen. This really has a lot to do with Steven Spielberg and the way that he directs movies, and I think that's what he brings to the table the most, is this sense of awe. It's the Jaws effect. you don't actually see the magic of the house until you're well into the second act of the film. He does such a great job in his movies to make you patient, to force you to wait to see it happen. And so we know from the trailers and the premise that the house is alive, but the way that he makes you wait to see that, it's really something special. I think this is where the movie starts to fall apart, and it tries to get too smart for itself. They try to name off body parts within the house as if she literally became the house, like her tongue and her uvula.
If those are the teeth and that's the tongue, then that must be the uvula.
Oh, so it's a girl house.
I think there's something there, and as a kid you definitely start to point those things out and feel like it's really smart, but honestly it's just not. And then there's the whole buried in cement aspect of what actually happened to the wife. The dude comes back from the hospital, he didn't actually die, and now he is with the kids trying to explain what happened. And I appreciate that the film gives some sort of explanation for why this house is alive, but it is just very confusing and doesn't actually track. And the most confusing part is honestly Nevercracker himself. There's some scenes where he loves his wife and he's trying to protect her, but there's other ones where he's like, we gotta destroy it now. And so which is it, Nevercracker? Do you love her? Do you want to protect her? Or do you want to burn her to the ground? Turns out he wants to burn her to the ground. And that's a completely fair move because she is an evil house that's taking people. But I couldn't help but feel sad at the end of this. I feel sad for the house. I feel sad for Constance. Did she deserve this? No. I don't in any way feel like she chose to be a part of this house. But eventually they do burn it down. They all get their stuff back. People come out of the basements who were eventually missing before. And the kids decide that they actually aren't too old to go trick-or-treating, which is a cute ending, I suppose. But turns out a lot of people agree that this ending isn't great. And historically, there was this girl who wrote to Dan Harmon complaining about the ending. And he replied very publicly and is like, guess what? I agree with you. Not only did he agree with her, but he went on to explain that the film had a lot of rewrites and was beyond his control, and called Kanan, the director, a hack, and Steven Spielberg a moron. Which is like such a Dan Harmon thing to say, especially considering how self-aware he tries to be within his sitcoms. Like, if there's one guy who hates tropes, it's Dan Harmon. And if there is a few guys who are the most tropey guys in Hollywood, it's probably Steven Spielberg and Robert Zemeckis. Sitting right now, this film does have a 75% on Rotten Tomatoes, which is honestly pretty good for an animated movie in the mid-2000s. At the box office, it did pretty well. It opened alongside Clerks 2, Lady in the Water, My Super Ex-Girlfriend, and it came in second place behind Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Man's Chest, which is not a bad film to be behind. Like I briefly mentioned earlier, it was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Animated Feature, like most animated features usually are, especially in that decade. To put into perspective, there were only 3 that were nominated that year: Monster House, Cars, and the winner, Happy. Some other things I want to point out about this film is the camera angles. It's very unique, and this is another technology that they were able to use for the first time. There's one shot where it kind of goes into the lawn and gives you this really big perspective of how small these characters actually are, and there's a lot of cool shots like that give you different dimensions to this world. For the most part, I think the humor holds up. There's one line with the police that I don't think would fly if this movie was written today. I will shoot you. And of course, like other movies, there's all sorts of trivia on IMDb, like John Heder, who plays Skuld, tripped over wiring and broke his ankle on the first day of set. But overall, this movie was fun. I think it's a magical experience and a very unique animated feature that we don't always see these days. Watching this as an adult, you can definitely see influences by Zemeckis and Spielberg, and honestly, very little of Dan Harmon, which I think is unfortunate because I would love to see his take on a movie like this. But that's Monster House. When was the last time you watched this? Why don't you give it a pop on Netflix? Let me know your thoughts. Comment below. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and I will see you next time.